With no other alternative, a mother was forced to leave her 5-year-old daughter in the care of an uncle, someone she barely knew. Little did she know what was to come. When the girl told her what had happened, the mother immediately called the police. The security camera footage from her home revealed something unbelievable. What should have been just another ordinary day, like so many others, turned into an unexpected nightmare. Claire was overcome with rage, screaming at the top of her lungs, with tears of despair in her eyes. "What have you done to my daughter, you wretch? What have you done to her?" Her words were filled with pain and fury as she stared at her brother-in-law, the man to whom she had entrusted her daughter. The chaotic scene took place in front of Calvin's house, where the police were hastily called. "I didn't do anything, Claire. You can't just accuse me like that, without proof," replied the man, equally furious, trying to defend himself. The officers, realizing the gravity of the situation, intervened in an attempt to calm things down. "Please calm down. This is very serious, and we need to deal with it calmly," said one of the officers, trying to bring order to the growing chaos. The wind blew lightly, rustling the leaves of the trees around, creating an almost ironic contrast to the tension that hung in the air. Calvin, his face red with anger, shouted in response, "Are you crazy, Claire? After everything I've done for you, you call the police?" His voice trembled with indignation, and the veins in his neck pulsated clearly, showing how nervous and scared he was in the face of the serious accusations. Claire, still with tears streaming down her face, stared at the man intensely. In the back seat of the car, her daughter Molly, only 5 years old, slept. Her apparently peaceful sleep hid the horror of what she had revealed to her mother. Claire's hands were shaking uncontrollably. "She told me everything, Calvin. Please, you have to arrest him," he begged the officers, his voice thick with desperation. The officers, though hesitant, were ready to act. Calvin, still in disbelief at the situation he found himself in, demanded to know, "What did she tell you, Claire? For God's sake, what did she tell you?" The tension grew with each passing second, and the air seemed heavier, charged with conflicting emotions and a truth that was about to be revealed. Calvin turned to his mother, who was struggling to find the words as her sobs escaped uncontrollably. She could barely explain the pain she felt, as if a dagger were stuck in her chest just thinking about it. One of the officers, noticing her difficulty, took control of the situation and tried to explain more clearly. "Ma'am, your sister-in-law filed a complaint against you. The girl said that you took her to a dark room and—" He hesitated, feeling the weight of the serious accusations. The silence that followed was overwhelming. Calvin's eyes widened in disbelief. He had never imagined that his niece would tell Claire. The worst of it was that it wasn't a lie. His eyes widened even more, his mouth remained open, a mixture of shock and confusion. "Sir, we need an answer. Did you do this?" the officer asked in a serious and implacable tone. The man lowered his head, his shoulders slumped in a gesture of resignation. He knew there was no escape. He had to confess. "Yes, I did it," he said, his voice low, heavy with an indescribable weight, perhaps guilt, perhaps shame. The words hung in the air, thick as a fog of suffering. Claire sobbed loudly, while the police officers exchanged glances, ready to act with their hands firmly on their weapons. What should have been an ordinary day turned into a terrible nightmare. The look of horror on the mother's face was indescribable, her eyes wide and filled with tears that fell without stopping as she processed Calvin's confession. The pain and guilt she felt were almost palpable, dominating her thoughts. "It's all my fault, she repeated between sobs, remorse eating away at her heart. "I'm the one to blame for leaving my daughter alone with him. It's my fault, my God." The woman couldn't believe she had put her daughter through this. It had all started 6 months earlier, when her husband, Hugh, had died unexpectedly. Since then, Claire and her daughter, Molly, had been in dire straits, as Hugh had been unemployed at the time of his death, with no entitlement to benefits or government support. The distance from Hugh's family, who lived in another state, and the fact that Claire was an orphan with no close relatives to turn to, left mother and daughter in a desperate position. Their only chance of supporting Molly was to work several part-time jobs, but the money was barely enough to survive. Months later, Hugh's brother Calvin, moved by the plight of his sister-in-law and niece, whom he had never met, suggested that they both move to his city, where there would be better opportunities. "I'll take care of Molly while you're at work. You can leave her with me," he offered with a warm smile. For the first time in a long time, Claire felt a glimmer of hope. The idea of a full-time job seemed promising, and she could pick Molly up from her brother-in-law's house at the end of the day. But a shadow of doubt always lingered in her mind. She had never met Hugh's family and only knew what he had told her about them. Still, Claire, fearing the uncertain future, decided to trust him. Calvin worked from home, and she had no other options. For the first few days, everything seemed normal, and Claire began to feel more secure in her decision. Calvin seemed like a caring and loving uncle. However, everything fell apart when, 2 weeks after Molly started being cared for, the worst happened. The little girl approached her mother with a disturbing revelation that made her freeze. "Mommy, Uncle Calvin took me to a dark room and made me touch a snake." Her daughter's words echoed in Claire's mind like thunder. She was shocked, disbelief and horror written all over her face. How could someone who seemed so trustworthy do something so vile, so unthinkable? With each new detail Molly recounted, Claire's heart clenched even more, while tears streamed down her face. Claire vividly remembered the moments of despair after Hugh's unexpected death, and how everything seemed to fall apart around her. The difficulties she had faced in supporting her daughter were countless, and her brother-in-law, Calvin, had appeared as a solution to so many of her problems. But now, all that hope seemed to be a cruel lie. Pain and regret took over Claire like an unstoppable storm. "I always asked her how her day had been," Claire whispered between sobs. "And she always told me it was great, that they played together. But now she tells me you took her to a dark room." The woman felt a shiver run down her spine as she imagined how many times this could have happened and what else he could have done to her daughter. Calvin began to deny it desperately. "I didn't do anything to Molly, Claire," he exclaimed, his voice breaking. "Stop lying," she cried back, her voice thick with anguish. "Just admit it." And then, as if a light had appeared in the middle of the darkness, she remembered. "There are cameras here, I know there are." She knew her brother-in-law's house well enough to know that he kept cameras installed all over the place. For some reason, she had never actually gone inside the house. She used to just drop Molly off at the door in the morning and pick her up in the afternoon, never stopping to look around. Her routine was so exhausting that when Calvin invited her in for a drink, all she wanted to do was go home and sleep. She had gotten a job cleaning for a large company, and the work was tough. When Calvin offered her coffee at the end of the day, "No, Calvin, thank you. I'm too tired, let's go home," she politely declined. This constant exhaustion meant she had no time to really get to know her brother-in-law or spend time talking to him at his home. And now, it seemed so strange that he had cameras all over the place, even in the bedrooms, as Molly had told her. "She told me you said the cameras are on 24 hours a day," Claire insisted, her eyes filling with tears. "I want to see the footage from yesterday." The police then intervened, their presence becoming more firm. "Please, sir, if we can't see the footage, we'll have to arrest you immediately," one of the officers demanded. Calvin was in a terrible dilemma, his face etched with tension. He didn't know what to do. The confusion of the moment was evident, as the officers prepared to take more drastic action. Claire, on the verge of collapse, could barely contain herself. Her eyes, fixed on her brother-in-law, were filled with hatred and pain. She desperately tried to understand what could have happened to her daughter during the time she was in his care. The thought of something horrible happening to Molly made her stomach churn. "Show me the recordings, Calvin," she shouted again, her voice a mix of anger and desperation. The man huffed in annoyance and said he would go get his laptop. His voice was shaking, and he himself didn't know if it was fear or anger at his sister-in-law's accusations. Accompanied by an officer who followed him closely, making sure he didn't run away, Calvin walked toward the room with tense steps. His every movement was filled with indignation and frustration. When he reached for the laptop, He turned to Claire with a furious expression and snapped, "You're going to regret not talking to me first, Claire, especially after everything I've done for you and Molly." He began searching for the footage from the previous day, huffing with hatred, his eyes burning with a mixture of anger and resentment. The officer next to Calvin observed every detail, ready to act in the face of any unexpected reaction. Meanwhile, Claire was overcome by an overwhelming mix of fear and anxiety. Her heart was beating so hard it felt like it was about to explode. Every second of waiting felt like an eternity, increasing her agony in the face of this desperate situation. "This is what you get for opening your home to strangers," Calvin muttered, his trembling fingers wandering through the folders on his laptop, unable to contain the resentment that was growing inside him. Feeling betrayed by the very family he had tried to help, Calvin continued to mumble. Claire remained motionless, each word he uttered hitting her like a punch. Her heart clenched, and her stomach twisted with fear, fearing what she might see on the recordings. "I will never forgive myself," she thought, while an overwhelming feeling of guilt invaded her. Tears silently ran down her mother's face, who kept her eyes fixed on the screen, waiting for the inevitable. Calvin, still mumbling, gave Claire a look of pure disdain and said, "Apologize to me later," before pressing play on the video. The woman could barely breathe, her eyes almost glued to the screen, while the silence in the room became absolute, broken only by the sound of the video starting to play. Calvin glared at his sister-in-law, resentful that she would question his innocence, but Claire ignored him, prepared for the worst. Her heart was beating wildly, while the police officers, although anxious, maintained professionalism and were ready to intervene if necessary. Every second that passed was torture for everyone present. As the video progressed, it seemed as if time was dilating, stretching the suffering. When the images finally began to reveal themselves, Claire's eyes widened and she stood up from her chair, still stunned by what she was seeing. There were Calvin and little Molly, entering a dark room, exactly as the girl had described. However, an internal camera was activated, revealing that the place was equipped with several shelves full of books, glass jars, and scientific equipment arranged on the counters. The room had an air of seriousness and concentration, illuminated only by a few dim lights that highlighted a large glass case. Inside the case, several colorful snakes moved slowly, showing their shiny scales. It was the habitat of some snakes of the species Xenopeltis unicolor. Molly, with a smile on her face, pointed at the reptiles and exclaimed, "So beautiful, Uncle. Look, it's so blue." She was clearly enchanted by what she saw. Calvin, next to her, patiently explained, "This blue one glows in the dark, and that green one glows too." The girl's eyes shone with curiosity and admiration as she watched the snakes in fascination. The tensions in the room, previously high to the extreme, began to change tone with the unexpected revelation of the images. As he watched the snake's sinuous movements, the room was filled with a stunned silence. Those present were stunned by the unexpected revelation. Their reactions were of complete surprise when they realized that what seemed to be a threat was actually something harmless. Calvin, with a calm smile on his face, began to explain to Claire and the police officers what was really at stake. "I study this species because of its iridescent glow," Calvin revealed, showing himself to be a dedicated researcher. "I'm a biologist," he confirmed, seeing the disbelief in Claire's eyes. She was pale, and the police officers around him also seemed confused by the new information. Calvin continued to explain that his house was equipped with cameras because of his profession. "I have 3 rooms dedicated to my work, which function as laboratories full of expensive equipment and research products. The room where the snakes are is dark because they are cave animals and prefer such environments," he detailed in a firm and confident voice. He went on to reveal that his research focuses on the iridescent glow of snakes, which is caused by a natural substance produced by the animal skin. Their ability to live in dark, moist environments causes them to produce a natural coating that prevents the growth of fungi and bacteria, which are common in these habitats. "This compound could be key to developing new antibiotics, which is the focus of my research," Calvin explained. He then explained that he had shown Molly the snakes and let her pet them, stressing that they were non-venomous and completely harmless. "I would never put my niece in danger," he stated with conviction. Even with the detailed explanations, Claire was still in a state of shock, trying to process everything she was hearing and seeing. The video showed Molly petting the head of one of the reptiles, her excitement evident as she jumped up and down with joy. Calvin, determined to prove his innocence, also showed other recordings that documented everyday moments with Molly in the house. The footage showed the two enjoying ice cream and pizza, and the little girl seemed genuinely happy and comfortable in her uncle's company. The revelation brought unexpected relief, but the complexity of the situation still loomed large as everyone tried to assimilate the new information. However, Calvin had always asked little Molly to keep the details of her work a secret, as the research was confidential. This made the girl, feeling that she could not share anything with her mother, even more cautious and suspicious. When Claire finally pressed her daughter for answers, Molly revealed that her uncle had taken her to a dark room and shown her his snakes, which ended up creating a terrible misunderstanding that terrified her. With Calvin's detailed explanation, Claire's expression changed from shock to a mixture of relief and shame. The tension that surrounded the police officers, who had been ready to act, dissipated, and they seemed visibly relaxed when they realized that they were not dealing with a criminal who abused children. The atmosphere began to relax, but there was still a certain discomfort in the air. Calvin, the biologist, was deeply upset by the situation, not only because the confusion had exposed his confidential research, but also because the discomfort of being approached by the police in his own home caused him great embarrassment. He sighed deeply, looking at Claire with a mixture of disappointment and sadness. "I'm so sorry, Calvin. Please forgive me," Claire begged, her voice thick with remorse and embarrassment as tears rolled freely down her face. The fear he felt that something bad had happened to his daughter dissipated, replaced by the discomfort of having wrongly accused an innocent man of something so horrible. Calvin remained silent for a few moments, processing the situation. He understood that Claire's actions had been motivated by a mother's love and concern, but that didn't make the situation any less painful for him. "I understand, Claire, but this was really hard for me," he confessed, his voice revealing the pain he felt. It took a few days before Calvin was able to begin to forgive his sister-in-law, and the process of reconciliation was long and difficult. He reflected on the situation and realized that, although his concern had been genuine, the need for further clarification was clear. He explained in detail the nature of his work and the importance of maintaining confidentiality, which helped to clear up the misunderstanding. After hearing his explanations, the man accepted Claire's apology, understanding that her reaction had been an instinctive reflection of her role as a mother. After this episode, Claire continued to entrust Molly's care to her uncle, now certain that he was a person she could truly trust. The bond between uncle and niece grew even stronger, and Claire made a conscious effort to be more involved in Molly's life. United by the grief of losing Hugh, they wanted to ensure that the little girl grew up surrounded by family love and support. Although the misunderstanding was a difficult subject to remember, they managed to overcome it. Calvin proved to be an admirable man, dedicating time and affection to the little girl and treating her as a precious reminder of her beloved brother. He made sure that Molly was always safe and happy while he continued his important research. Claire, in turn, learned a valuable lesson about the importance of trust and the need to avoid rash decisions based on accusations. She understood the importance of clarifying any suspicions before taking drastic measures. Thus, the relationship with the biologist became stronger and more respectful. The family became closer, strengthened by bonds of trust and love, learning to value truth, open communication, and mutual trust. If you liked this story, I'm sure the next video that appears on your screen will surprise you. Don't forget to subscribe, give a thumbs up, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in our next exciting stories.